We are studying Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad. The present chapter, titled The Supreme Word, explores the verse number 4. That which is unexpressed by the word, that by which the word is expressed, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. In the text of this chapter, Sri Aurobindo goes into the deeper meaning of the word, the importance given in the Vedic system to the word as the creative power. By the word, Brahma creates the forms of the universe, and human speech is only a reflection in the microcosmos of human form of that creative power, however weakened, diffused as a pale reflection. Still, in the text of the chapter which we have so far covered, Sri Aurobindo has gone into the deeper science and the principle behind the mantra, that the word itself, the word of the mantra, is born out of the secret depths of our being, where it has been brooded upon by a deeper consciousness than the mental, framed in the heart, held in the mind, again concentrated on by the waking mental consciousness, and then thrown out silently or vocally. And the power of the mantra, thus enunciated, carries in its vibration the capacity to change the mental and vital atmosphere, as well as produce changes in the physical plane. He observes also how, in fact, we are using this power constantly in our routine of day-to-day thought, emotion, and speech, although we are unconscious of how this power is used, and it is only weakly used. He says, the Vedic use of the mantra is only a conscious utilization of this secret power of the word. He discusses also how matter is only the formed of certain vibrations of energy, behind which are vibrations of the life force, behind which vibrations of the mind, and behind that the creative vibrations of the supramental consciousness, implying a supreme vision and discernment. And therefore we can say all vibration, all sound represents vibration on one of these planes. And there is a movement from the highest down to the most material, which eventually ends in the creation of matter and form in the vibrations of the ether. And this is the theory of the creation by the word, which belongs to the Vedic system. And we had covered all these. And finally he says, this then is the supreme word, speech of our speech. It is the vibration of pure existence, instinct to the perceptive and originative power of infinite and omnipotent consciousness, shaped by the mind behind the mind into the inevitable word of the truth of things, out of whatever substance on whatever plane. The form or physical expression emerges by its creative agency. The supermind, using the word, is the creative logos. So in this view, we see this vibrational power, creative power of the word operating on all the planes of existence. Although our sight is limited to the most material, we can sense subjectively the effects in the life energy and in the mind of this creative power. In the paragraph we are now studying, Sri Aurobindo discusses three facets of this word of power. First, he says the word has its seed sounds. Then he says it has its forms. And then it has its rhythms. Of each of these three, he gives a brief elaboration. And the last time we had explored the seed sounds. Sri Aurobindo says the word has its seed sounds suggesting the eternal syllable of the Veda, U, Ma, Om, and the seed sounds of the tantrics, which carry in them the principles of things. We saw last time what these are like, the seed sounds, having dwelt before that on the Om, and we also saw how these vibrations of sounds are organized in the human consciousness, in the various centers of consciousness, the chakras. In fact, the entire Sanskrit alphabet is structured not only according to the vocal structure of the throat, rather we would say the throat is structured along the lines of the subtle alphabet, but the sounds of the alphabet in exactly the same sequence are organized through the chakras from top down, following the sequence of petals on each of the lower 5 chakras. And this is something quite surprising when we consider how precise and specific the whole system is. It is as if the creative word, as it moves into the domain of form, unfolds itself in these sounds, vibrational powers, and as it forms the human being through the evolutionary process, it organizes precisely these vibrational powers within the human consciousness in precisely those centers which have developed successively through the evolution, beginning with the lowest, rising to the highest, completing eventually in the unfolding of the lotus at the top of the head, of which the only vibration is the Om, which is the first originating vibration which includes all others. And we see mapped out in the human body the whole sequence of cosmic vibrations top down, beginning with the Om above and then unfolding downwards through the whole alphabet. The seed sounds of the tantrics, also which he refers to, we saw a few last time. I wanted to make some further observations before we move on beyond that. That when we observe the nature of the seed sounds, and we listed a few, such as Haum, Doom, Kreem, Reem, Shreem, Aim, Kleem, etc., we find a certain commonality among all these sounds. We find they are related also in their effective power to the associated meaning in Sanskrit of those root sounds. So, for example, Kraum, the kr, you will feel, has a sharpness, harshness, rough edge to it. But the kraum itself represents a certain vibration of, which may be described as, in the psychological terms, as a vibration of anger, energy which is almost chaotic in its outburst. But you will see how in Sanskrit, krodha emerges from this root sound. Anger, the word anger comes from this root sound. Similarly, sham has the psychological quality of calming, settling, stabilizing. And in Sanskrit, the word shanti comes from this word, and so on. You will see these very interesting correspondences between the pure vibrational psychological bundle that the root sounds carry, and then the whole emergence of the language and its psychological meanings and thought forms, etc. When Putting all these root sounds together, we see a certain three-step process. Taking, for example, something like chrome. So there is first the sound which bursts out, the k, and a certain force in the sound. Sometimes there will be a h, so the shreem, so the sh, h, r, eem, and then the fading out. So there's an initial burst, a certain contact, a force of the unfoldment, and then after that, a kind of a fading out with one of the letters, E, U, or E, and fading out into the M, the sound fading into a kind of a resonance that drifts into silence. And you will recall in the text we had read earlier on the origins of speech and the power of the sound in word formation, Sri Aurobindo had made this comment of how the Shabd, the Vak, emerges from the Akasha and settles through the five elements. And he says, therefore, and so arrives into being with these three characteristics. First, certain contactual vibrations. Secondly, a particular kind of tejas or force. Thirdly, a particular form. And you see these three things represented in the very way in which the root sounds of the tantrics are expressed. So, but this is as far as we can go here on this idea. The word, which is not belonging to the domain of form, in the original creative vibration, which manifests on all the planes of existence, as it moves into the domain of form, it has its seed sounds, the Om and the seed sounds of the tantrics. Second, now he says, it has its forms, which stand behind the revelatory and inspired speech that comes to man's supreme faculties. And these compel the forms of things in the universe. So the form itself is undergoing several levels of translation. First, that pure vibration has its forms which stand behind the revelatory and inspired speech. Then from there is a reflection in the revelatory inspired speech which comes to man's higher faculties. And this is in the domain of above mind and intuitive perception, where form is still somewhat fluid. The domain which we sometimes experience in symbolic dreams, where we see objects, feel their forces, but they are represented often to us in certain forms, in certain shapes, or in certain geometric patterns which have a vibrational, tangible quality and a psychological quality associated with them. So there it is reflected through the revelatory and inspired speech. And that compels the forms of things in the universe. We see now something very interesting, that form in the material universe has its origin in subtler grades of forms which are not as fixed as the material, but of which certain material forms are more true representations. And you will notice also the properties carry over across through the levels. So for example, if we take a form, and this comes to certain very basic geometric descriptions, what form can you make the simplest, which is stable? Take a few sticks, join them to make a form. What can you make which would be stable, which would not bend easily? And the simplest of them, and you will notice automatically the simplest you can get is the pyramid. Triangular base and one point on top. You cannot break it by pressing it. You cannot bend it. Or in 2 dimensions, it would be the basic triangle. Of these triangles, the triangle with the three sides equally of equal length would be the most symmetric. If you turn it, you will not be able to distinguish one side from the other. So it is the most essential, the most simple of the stable forms. If you look at the most perfect form, you can turn it any amount, you cannot recognize the difference. That would be a circle, or in 3 dimensions, a sphere. And so we see certain qualities, characteristics, which each form seems to express. A square, similarly, has a certain character. When the mother is asked, why does the square represent the supermind? She says, I don't know, but that's how it is. That's how it seems. Or actually in 3 dimensions, it is the cube. And she said, that's how it is. And when she saw symbolically the supramental power, it was as a cube which was rotating, which had this character of being as fluid as gas and yet as hard as diamond. But this, of course, is how one perceives it on that level before it comes into the material plane. In the material plane, now it is formed of material substance, not the essential psychological substance, or its even more causal substance above that. Here it has got the character of the substance much more than the form. So if you take a cube made of what? You could have a cube made of sponge, or a cube made of granite, or a cube made of metal. The character of the material precedes the quality of the form. But when you move to the psychological plane, in the dream state, or in the higher ranges in the dream state, the form gives off the quality, the substance is secondary. And as you go still higher into the causal status, there even the form is not felt as so rigid in the way we visualize it, but it is sensed in something which is like the prototype of form. And that is why it is these essential forms which seem to carry that vibration most directly, most purely. And this is the reason why the ancients were fascinated by these geometric forms, saw in them material representations of those higher psychological powers, and developed a whole science of utilizing these forms. When the form is thus drawn or cast into 3 dimensions, or drawn on paper or metal in 2 dimensions, it automatically comes in resonance with its higher vibrations on higher planes. And so such a drawing made here in matter would tend to accumulate or draw those vibrations from the psychological planes. And this is the basis of a whole lot of technology, we may say, which uses material things to influence psychological forces. We call that, in common terms, magic. But magic has a character of something we do not understand, which is beyond logic. In fact, there is something very logical. It's a very refined science which is developed along these lines. And you will see when you go to certain shops, just at the entrance, they have something which is drawn in copper often. These are yantras. The word yantra itself is the same word we use to describe machines. But these are not physical machines with physical levers. They're psychological devices. And as a psychological device, they attract the power which that form represents. And especially if it is cast in a state of concentration, where the person doing the drawing concentrates on the vibration that the drawing represents, he can invoke and imprint with great force that vibration, and thereafter that physical substance continues to radiate those vibrations and attract things which have affinity to those vibrations. And that is why they put these in shops, either for protection or for attracting the power of wealth, and so on. Similar things are also placed by people as a symbol of protection on their body. And so there's this whole science behind that. It is for this reason also that the ancients valued numbers and particular arrangements of numbers. Even today, if you look at a mathematics book, they will have these as puzzles, casual puzzles, almost as a game, where you put numbers in a certain arrangement so that the numbers add up to the same vertically and horizontally and sometimes diagonally. And those things are called magic squares. Now, there's nothing magic in adding up numbers, but it is a magic square because these are the squares used in magic. And the sum total of those numbers, horizontal, vertical, etc., correspond in resonance to certain psychological powers. And the fact that the numbers are arranged in that particular way creates the resonance by which those powers are invoked or evoked. And so we see behind physical form and behind the most basic structures of physical shapes, this whole inner dimension, occult, and beyond that, even inspired and spiritual, which is part of the word, the creative vibration which manifests the divine. So it has its forms which stand behind the revelatory and inspired speech that comes to man's supreme faculties, and these compel the forms of things in the universe. And finally, the word, it has its rhythms. For it is no disordered vibration, but moves out into great cosmic measures. And according to the rhythm is the law, arrangement, harmony, processes of the world it builds. Life itself is a rhythm of God. So this is the third facet of the word. It may seem, when he sequences it thus, that it is the last of the three, and therefore perhaps the least important. And that would be correct if we see top down. Because first there is the vibration in sound, then the form, and then the rhythm. But when it enters into the domain of manifestation, and especially in the domain of the human experience in physical matter, often it is the rhythm which acquires a greater force and greater importance than the other two. Because it is by the rhythm that you have the pattern which is set, the repetition, and which creates the resonance from which the form emerges, from which the sound comes. So, seen from below, it is often seen in the reverse order in importance. So let's say, take the example which we had discussed earlier. We have a membrane, a stretched surface, and you vibrate it with electrical vibrations, a loudspeaker, put a fine powder on it, and through the vibrations, the powder is rearranged and forms geometrical shapes and symbols. So the first thing that is happening is there is a certain rhythm. The rhythm leads to the form, and then you hear the sound which is reaching your ears. So there is a reversal of the sequence when we look at things bottom up. So what is this rhythm? He says, it is no disordered vibration, but moves out into great cosmic measures. At its highest level, when something emerges from a consciousness which is infinite and eternal, the very first formulation will carry with it infinity and eternity. But when infinity and eternity have to manifest in the domain of form, of finiteness, and of time, how can they represent themselves? The natural way in which that happens is a cycle repeating. It's not by chance that in mathematics you represent infinity by a symbol which is a loop that goes round and round, sideways 8. It goes round and round, it never ends. or it is represented in certain mystical traditions in the symbol of the snake, which eats its own tail. So there is a beginning, there is an end, but you cannot distinguish the beginning from the end because it repeats itself. You will see almost everything that exists in the universe, although it has a sense of a beginning or an end, you can never trace a beginning to an exact starting point. When we look at the emergence of various life forms and species, we end up with this classic problem: which came first, the chicken or the egg? Without the egg, you cannot have the chicken, but without the chicken, you cannot have the egg. So, where was the origin? And we cannot resolve the problem because the problem cannot be resolved in these terms. It has to be resolved from a different plane. But the same thing exists in any process. You can trace the process back and you will find another process from which it originates. Trace that back and you'll find another process from which it originates. You cannot find an exact point that says, before this there was nothing, from here it started. There is always something out of which the new thing emerges, and there is always a continuity. And out of the new thing, there is no sudden end. There is always a transition to something else. And so it is in this way that infinity and eternity organize themselves in space, in time, of finiteness, by rhythms, by repetitions. But the rhythms themselves can be of various kinds. And each type of rhythm carries a certain character of force. There can be a rhythm which comes in a great burst and then gradually spreads out. Or there can be a rhythm which gently enters and then builds up force. Or there can be rhythms which capture certain numerical patterns, and so they can carry more complex psychological characters. So he says, moves out into great cosmic measures. In the ancient tradition of yoga, even time itself and the eternity of time is described in great, gigantic cosmic rhythms of kalpa. And the kalpa itself is one day of Brahma, the creative consciousness. Within that, there are sub-cycles, 1,000 Chatur-yugas. Within that are the yugas, and so on. Each of these has the same proportions as the whole repeated within each. So there is a kind of a self-symmetry, which again something we would expect. If what is manifested comes from a consciousness that is complete, then the manifestation also must be complete. And when it is complete, any part of it will reflect the completeness of the whole. And so we have this holographic character, self-symmetry in the whole universe. Any part you can take is connected with the whole because there is an underlying unity behind the whole. And so even these cosmic rhythms have their sub-rhythms, sub-cycles, which reflect the original, but which have also the freedom of variation. And all the combinations of all these variations represent, express, manifest different psychological powers, energies, forces. So according to the rhythm is the law, arrangement, harmony, processes of the world it builds. So the law is at a level which is more abstract. When we speak of a law, let's say a law of physics, we mean by that something which applies across space and across time, which is inviolable, which is as if an eternal truth represented. When force is mass multiplied by acceleration, simple formula of physics. This is described as a law because it is everywhere the same. Conservation of energy is a law because everywhere at all times it is the same. So where does the law exist? Not in the physical form. It is above the form. It is a level of abstraction. The law determines how things will get arranged. It puts things in or holds things in certain proportions and arrangements. And those arrangements, because now they repeat themselves, they form the basis of the harmony. And because the harmony is so set, these are the things in balance which create the harmony. Therefore, the processes of unfolding follow. So there are these 4 degrees from the most abstract law to the entry into form in arrangement. And when arrangement itself takes a settled state, it is a harmony. And from that settled state to the next settled state is the process. And there can be many laws, therefore many arrangements, harmonies, and processes of the world it builds. In the ancient Vedic science of mantra, they sought to capture all 3 things: the seed sounds, the forms, as well as the rhythms. So the seed sounds, as we have already discussed, they are articulated, they can be spoken, they can be noted. The forms similarly geometrically organized, and the rhythms themselves were captured in the formulation of the mantra and often represented the particular character of the mantra. And just as the seed sounds have a presiding consciousness behind, which is then represented as a deity, so too the geometric patterns have a presiding consciousness behind, therefore a deity. And similarly, each of the rhythms has a presiding consciousness behind, which is also described as a deity. Sometimes the deity itself may be worshipped in certain ways. There are 7 Chamba Rhythms, which are considered to be the major ones. Gayatri, the Gayatri mantra, which is so well known. The Gayatri itself represents the meter, not the mantra. And any mantra in that rhythm could be called a Gayatri. There is the Ushnuk, there is the Anushtubh, there is the Brihati, there is the Pankti, Trishtubh, and Jagati. Jagati meaning literally world formation. And each of these has very specific numbers of syllables and steps. So Gayatri has 3 steps of 8 syllables. Anushtubh has 4 steps of 8 syllables. Trishtubh would have 4 steps of 11 syllables. Jagati 4 steps of 12 syllables, and so on. Each of these might have secondary variations. Then there are secondary mantras, secondary chandas, which may combine, and so on. So all of these were taken by the Vedic rishis into a very refined and complex science. Sri Aurobindo refers to this in his writing on poetry, in the text of the Future Poetry. He speaks of how sound came to represent certain fixed ideas because of certain quality of sensation and emotion which the sound already conveys, which then gets associated with a certain activity or experience, eventually an idea. So we need not go into that because we've already seen it in many ways. And then regarding the rhythm, he says, there's a whole chapter titled Rhythm and Movement in the Future Poetry. The mantra, poetic expression of the deepest spiritual reality, is only possible when 3 highest intensities of poetic speech meet and become indissolubly one. A verbal form, a highest intensity of rhythmic movement, a highest intensity of verbal form and thought substance, of style, and the highest intensity of the soul's vision of truth. I see here he is going precisely in this opposite sequence, from below upwards. First, he speaks of highest intensity of rhythmic movement. He says in that text that often it is because the rhythm is neglected that even poetry which touches high spiritual content does not have the necessary force. And sometimes if the rhythm is made strong, even if the thought substance or vision is weak, still we experience in that poetry much greater force and impact. So first he speaks of highest intensity of rhythmic movement, then highest intensity of verbal form and thought substance of style. This would correspond to the form of the idea, although we were discussing earlier physical forms, the same thing on the idea level. And then the third, a highest intensity of the soul's vision of truth. All great poetry comes about by a unison of these three elements. It is the insufficiency of one or other or another which makes the inequalities in the work of even the greatest poets. And it is the failure of some one element which is the cause of their lapse, of the scoria in their work, the spots in the sun. But it is only at a certain highest level of the fused intensities that the mantra becomes possible. Then he says, from a certain point of view, it is the rhythm, the poetic movement, which is of primary importance. For that is the first fundamental, indispensable element, without which all the rest, whatever its other value, remains unacceptable to the muse of poetry. And here there's already a suggestion that there is a deity presiding over poetry, the muse, a consciousness. Then he says, a perfect rhythm will often even give immortality to work which is slight in vision and very far from the higher intensities of style. But it is not merely metrical rhythm, even in a perfect technical excellence, which we mean when we speak of poetic movement. And now he will describe the sense of rhythm from the most material to the higher spiritual. That perfection, the technical rhythm, that perfection is only the first step, the physical basis. There must be a deeper and more subtle music, a rhythmical soul movement entering into the metrical form and often overflooding it before the real poetic achievement begins. A mere metrical excellence, however subtle, rich, or varied, however perfectly it satisfies the outer ear, does not meet the deeper aims of the creative spirit. For there is an inner hearing which makes its greater claim, and to reach and satisfy it is the true aim of the creator of melody and harmony. This is very close to what we are reading already in the text of the Kena Upanishad. That which hears in our hearing. There is an inner ear, and the power of the poetry touches the inner ear much more than the outer ear. Although the outer ear holds our surface attention, the inner listener is tuned into the inner ear and the inner vibration. So he continues, nevertheless, meter, by which we mean a fixed and balanced system of the measures of sound, matra, is not only the traditional, but also surely the right physical basis for the poetic movement. Then he discusses how there are poets who have tried to have a free poetry without meter and so on. We skip that, and then he comes to something very important. He says, Milton, disparaging rhyme, which he had himself used with so much skill in his earlier, less sublime but more beautiful poetry, forgot or ignored the spiritual value of rhyme, its power to enforce and clinch the appeal of melodic or harmonic recurrence, which is a principal element in the measured movement of poetry. Its habit of opening sealed doors to the inspiration, its capacity to suggest and reveal beauty to that supra-intellectual something in us, which music is powerful to awake. So now he's speaking of the rhyme, when at the end of the sentence, suddenly there is that same sound in the rhyme. Something happens deep within us at those higher levels. which has almost the same effect as the power of music. It can open sealed doors to the inspiration, he says. The Whitmanic technique falls into a similar but wider error. When mankind found out the power of thought and feeling thrown into fixed and recurring measures of sound to move and take possession of the mind and soul, they were not discovering a mere artistic device, but a subtle truth of psychology, of which the conscious theory is preserved in the Vedic tradition. A very interesting description here. And the Vedic tradition still holds this knowledge that the power of thought and feelings can be conveyed very effectively through fixed and recurring measures of sound. That is, when there is this mathematical measure of proportions which repeats itself, it can convey those powers of thought and feeling and convey it in a way that it has the power to take possession of the mind and soul. So now straight away from this, we see not only the importance of the rhythm in the mantra, but also the importance of the cycles of rhythm in music. The melody may go on and have infinite variations, but it is the rhythm behind which holds together the melody, gives to it a certain solid basis, and grabs our attention, holds our attention. You will see when listening to, especially in Indian music, when listening to a concert, where the music is often flowing at that moment, inspired, spontaneous, something never before created. And then there is the tabla, which is holding the rhythm and pattern. You will find after a long wandering piece of music, the singer or the player comes back in synchronization with the tabla. And at that moment, they join together and there's a blum, a synchronization with a force. And you will feel the whole audience surge in energy, in delight, in a certain joy, in a certain mood, a burst of a certain intensity which takes place. This is often reflected in the body language of the players or the musicians when they come in sync and everything just falls into place. And there is a certain attraction if you observe what happens within you subjectively. As the music moves towards that synchronization, there is a certain anticipation. Your mind and your emotions are as if expecting this to happen and are attuning themselves in the rhythm. And suddenly, when it reaches that point, there is an explosion, a release, as if a door opens and something felt, seen, experienced. And it is done deliberately. In the actual science of music, whether it is vocal or instrumental, when these different rhythms are described and they are noted, there is a certain system in the notation. Interestingly, in the notation itself, the spiritual truth is represented. There is always a starting point, an initiation, which is in the modern notation marked with a plus. But there is a point in the rhythm which is the emptiness, the khali, where all the bass is withdrawn. If you're playing the tabla, the bass is withdrawn. In the music also, there is as if a vacuum which is created, and which is as if the emptiness which holds and sustains the form that emerges. And all of these things are ingrained in the very form of the music and the science of music. And of course, in the mantric tradition equally. So Sri Aurobindo continues in this text. And when the ancient Indians chose more often than not to throw whatever they wished to endure, even philosophy, science, and law, into metrical form, it was not merely to aid the memory. So you'll find all the deepest, most profound knowledge, philosophy, science, and even the law is held in chandas, in rhythms. They were able to memorize huge prose Brahmanas quite as accurately as the Vedic hymnal or metrical Upanishads. So it was not just for memory. But because they perceived that metrical speech has in itself not only an easier durability, but a greater natural power than unmetrical. Not only an intenser value of sound, but a force to compel language and sense, a force to compel language and sense to heighten themselves in order to fall fitly into this stricter mold. There is perhaps a truth in the Vedic idea that the spirit of creation framed all the movements of the world by chandas in certain fixed rhythms of the formative word. And it is because they are faithful to the cosmic meters that the basic movements unchangingly endure. So he's even suggesting that it is because of this power of the chandas that that knowledge and the force which was put into those metrical forms has lasted for so long. Because they are in tune with those cosmic meters and carry their sense of eternity and immortality. A balanced harmony maintained by a system of subtle recurrences is the foundation of immortality in created things. And metrical movement is simply creative sound grown conscious of this secret of its own powers. Again, very suggestive. When Sri Aurobindo writes in this way, it is on one level, of course, very poetic because it holds and connects you with higher intuitive truths. But it is also very suggestive, and you can see how this principle applies everywhere, even in the most physical processes. He says, a balanced harmony maintained by a system of subtle recurrences is the foundation of immortality in created things. All created things, as we have seen before in other discussions, have in that sense a beginning because they are created and therefore they have to have an end, a death. How do you make something immortal in the domain of created things? And the secret is this. The foundation of immortality is a balanced harmony maintained by a system of subtle recurrences. You must have recurrences, subtle, but systematic recurrences, and held in a harmony which is balanced. Now consider something very simple, our body. What is the difference between health and sickness? When the balanced harmony is lost, you have sickness. All the cells and all the organs are doing exactly what they were doing before, but now they are out of sync. Their harmony is lost, their internal balance is lost, and you have sickness. But in the nature of health, the things are brought back into harmony, you have health. But what is the nature of this balanced harmony? It is maintained by a system of subtle recurrence. Each cell is replaced by another cell. Each organ is continuously renewed. And so there is this recurrence which keeps things always young. And there's a system to that recurrence. Each has its proportion, its harmony even in the recurrence. And there is a larger balanced harmony which holds it all together. The same thing you will see if you go into the material domain at a molecular level, at an atomic level. What holds the atom into apparent permanence of form? And the whole physics is nothing but, you go into quantum physics, nothing but proportions, ratios, rhythms, patterns. You break that rhythm, break that ratio, the atom falls apart. Disbalance it, it falls apart. But inevitably tends to fall into a new balance. So you take a uranium atom, you break it, it forms two new atoms, a new balance, a new rhythm. Things want to move back into this balanced harmony. in which something is recurring, repeating. The electrons are moving, the protons and neutrons are internally exchanging themselves. Whatever the physics of it, there is a continuous internal change, recurrence in a system which is held in a balanced harmony. This is the foundation of immortality in created things. And the metrical movement of the mantra, of the piece of music, or of the poetry is simply creative sound grown conscious of this secret of its own powers. And then he speaks even here, there are all sorts of heights and gradations in the use of this power. So, because he's discussing poetry, he's discussing gradations of poetry and different kinds of poetry, different kinds of rhythm, and their effects in different types of poetry. And finally, he says, still, the definitive verdict on their verse is that it is nothing, after describing many poets, is that it is nothing more than an effective jog-trot of Pegasus, a pleasing canter or a showy gallop. It has great staying power. Indeed, there seems no reason why, once begun, it should not go on forever. You know, there's the poetry which is like a horse galloping, ta-ta-tup, 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 ta-ta-tup. It carries the poet easily over his ground, but it does nothing more. Certainly no real soul movement can get easily into this mold. So it has its merits and its powers. It is good for metrical romances of a sort, for war poetry and popular patriotic poetry. But perhaps any poetry which wants to be an echo of life. It may stir, not the soul, but the vital being in us, like a trumpet, or excite it like a drum. But after all, the drum and the trumpet, after all, the drum and the trumpet do not carry us far in the way of music. So he's giving examples like that of different rhythms, the effects of instruments, and so on. It's worth reading in its whole, but I wanted to complete with one final observation which relates to our text. So what happens when the whole thing is raised? But this is only the technical side, having discussed the technicals, beats, measures, etc., rhythms. The physical means by which the effect is produced, but it is not the artistic intelligence or the listening physical ear which is most at work, but something within, trying to bring out an echo of hidden harmonies, a secret of rhythmical infinities within us. It is not a labor of the devising intellect or the aesthetic sense which the poet has achieved, but a labor of the spirit within him itself, to cast something out of the surge of the eternal depths. The other faculties are there in their place, but the conductor of the orchestral movement is the soul, coming forward to get its own work done by its own higher and unanalyzable methods. The result is something as near to wordless music as word music can get, and with the same power of soul life, of soul emotion, of profound supra-intellectual significance. In these higher melodies, in these higher harmonies and melodies, the metrical rhythm is taken up by the spiritual. That is the spiritual rhythm. It is filled with, or sometimes it seems rolled away and lost in a music that has really another and spiritual secret of movement. This is the intensity of poetic movement out of which the greatest possibility of poetic expression arises. It is where the metrical movement remains as a base, but either enshrines and contains, or is itself contained and floats in an element of greater music which exceeds it, and yet brings out all its possibilities. that the music fit for the mantra makes itself audible. So you have the physical base of the rhythm, and then above that there is a different kind of base, a different kind of a rhythm, a different kind of a meter which fills, which comes in the very way the sounds come and the value of the sounds and the feel, the thought and the spiritual power above. All these makes the music fit. That music fit for the mantra makes itself audible. It is the triumph of the spirit over the difficulties and limitations of the physical instrument. Its listener seems to be that eternal spirit whom the Upanishad speaks of as the ear of the ear, he who listens to all hearings. And behind the instabilities of word and speech, it is the inevitable harmonies of his own thought and vision for which he is listening. So this is a very interesting idea. When we are listening to the poetry or the music of this kind, that one who was the originator of the creative word and the creative rhythms is listening for those sounds and for those rhythms which he himself casts out. And he listens in us, through us, to that. And that's what makes this poetry, this mantra or this music spiritually expressive. The very next chapter, he again briefly refers to this before moving into style and substance. He says, rhythm is the premier necessity of poetical expression because it is the sound movement which carries on its wave the thought movement in the word. And it is the musical sound image which most helps to fill in, to extend, subtilize and deepen the thought impression or the emotional or vital impression, and to carry the sense beyond itself into an expression of the intellectually inexpressible. Always the peculiar power of music. This truth was better understood on the whole, or at least more consistently felt by the ancients than by the modern mind and ear. Perhaps because they were more in the habit of singing, chanting, or intoning their poetry, while we are content to read ours. A habit which brings out the intellectual and emotional element, but unduly depresses the rhythmic value. So we can stop with this here. So we see here the importance of the rhythm in the unfolding of the creative word. We read this last portion again. It has its rhythms, for it is no disordered vibration, but moves out into great cosmic measures. And according to the rhythm is the law, arrangement, harmony, processes of the world it builds. Life itself is a rhythm of God. And now we can feel much more intuitively, much more profoundly what is meant by this. Life itself is a rhythm of God. And we see in this each object, each form in its rhythmic movements, combining with other rhythms, combining with still larger rhythms, forming the rhythm of the human body form, expressing through this human body form the rhythms of the thoughts, the feelings, the actions, each a creative power of expression, even in dance or in theater. Although no word is spoken, the gesture can convey and throw out a certain vibration and a certain power. Most distinctly felt in the masters of mime. When you see a mime master, just a simple movement, a suggestion, and he creates a reality. Most of you would have seen this very common now exercise where somebody moves in mime as if moving across a wall, touching, holding an invisible wall and moving against it. And when the skilled master makes this movement, you can actually feel the reality of that wall almost tangibly. As he touches it, you can feel it tangibly in your own subtle sense. And such is the power that the physical expression, although not spoken in word or sound, can convey, because it too, in its forms, is an expression of the same creative word. And the physical expression would correspond to that form which stands behind the revelatory and inspired speech that comes to man's supreme faculties and compels forms of things in the universe. I did not dwell upon this much from the sense of dance, but in the Indian science of dance, they have certain basic form expressions of the human body. If you combine them all, you will find all possible form expressions by which the body can communicate. Psychological experiences or states are mapped out among these. And one who has mastered all these form expressions is said to be truly a master of dance. And there are exactly 108 essential form expressions, karikas as they are known. Very few today even know them or have mastered them. But so there is the whole science in which the ancients tried to capture that which is beyond form, moving and manifesting into form as the word, the creative word. And it is to this that the Kena Upanishad refers to when it speaks of the speech of our speech. That which is unexpressed by the word, that by which the word is expressed, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. In the next paragraph, Sri Aurobindo discusses the relationship between that word and our human word, and how that informs our word, and it is that which gives to our word the special power even of expression. So not only that the Brahman is the origin of all manifestation of vibrational expression in form, but within the form itself, he is as if seated and secretly expressing and giving force and power to whatever is expressed in vibration. So that's the idea in the next paragraph, which we will continue next Sunday. For now, we can briefly meditate on this theme.